It is Dr. Tim McKnight with us here on the BT Morning Show on Talk with the Doc. And you wanted to talk about vitamins and specific vitamin D today, so I have to start out by asking you, can we not get that in natural ways, at least somewhat? When you're out in the sun, are you absorbing that?
You definitely are. The problem is the studies show that we only get only 7.6% of the time the average person is outside. And, you know, if we've got our hats and sunglasses on and we're covered up because we're afraid of skin cancer or we're lathered up in sunblock, we're not getting the vitamin D exposure that we need. And real interesting that in anybody above or below above the 35th parallel in the northern hemisphere is going to not probably get enough natural sunlight to make a difference on vitamin D status.
Yeah. But at least it's a good try.
It's a good try. And it's, you know, I say I don't supplement with as much vitamin D from probably May through September when I am outside more and I have sun exposure. So I think that's the take-home message for me. You probably don't need as much vitamin D, but it's still important even in the summer living here in Ohio.
Well, introduce us to this. What is it good for? What is it doing for us?
Well, we all know that vitamin D is good for our bones, and what people often don't understand, is that vitamin D allows us to absorb calcium. So we need calcium in the bones. If you supplement with calcium, but you don't have enough vitamin D in your system, it won't get to your bones and it won't make a difference. So I don't really recommend a lot of calcium supplementation for bone issues like osteoporosis. I recommend vitamin D so you can absorb it. So we know that's a connection. We also know that supplementing with too much calcium may have some role in the progression of heart disease. So you really don't want too much calcium. You also don't want too much calcium because of the risk of kidney stones if you have a tendency to get those. But one real important role for vitamin D, vitamin D is not a vitamin, it's actually a hormone. It's a steroid hormone. It's made from cholesterol. It's like testosterone and estrogen and progesterone and all the other steroid hormones that are so good for us. But one important role with vitamin D is the immune system. Our immune cells have vitamin D receptors, and those immune cells function more efficiently and more effectively when there's enough vitamin D to help to activate them. So that's really, really critical. So we know that there are certain conditions where you're going to have an increased requirement for vitamin D. So one of these is those of us who are above the age of, I shouldn't say of us, those that are who over the age of 70 have a higher vitamin D requirement because they don't make as much in their skin.
And you're not there yet.
I'm not there yet. Okay. So I want to be excluded from that category for now. But the problem is they don't make enough vitamin D, partly because of skin exposure and partly because their biochemistry is just slowed down. It's not as efficient. Mm-hmm. So if you're above 70, your requirement goes up. If you're obese, if you're overweight and then obese and morbidly obese, the more obesity you have, the more that vitamin D will be stored in fat cells, and it's not available for use in the body. So your requirement for vitamin D actually goes up in obesity. And another interesting requirement is your skin tone. Lighter skinned people need less vitamin D because we absorb the sun more efficiently and make more vitamin D. The darker skinned you are, from Hispanics to African American, their requirement goes up because they're reflecting that light off the skin and they don't make as much vitamin D. So we have age, we have race, and we have your obesity level, and then sometimes your kidney function. If you have poor kidney function, your requirement goes up because the active form of vitamin D is made in the kidneys, and if the kidneys aren't effective, then you have more problems with this.
Yeah.
So those are some interesting, I think, observations. What is really fascinating to me is the role of vitamin D in helping us fight infections. So we know that there's a German study, it was a 15-year prospective study, so they looked into the future. And we know that if your vitamin D level is greater than 50, you have a higher survival rate for respiratory tract infections. I measure vitamin D almost in every one of my patients, and no one has a vitamin D level above 50 unless they're supplementing. Mm-hmm. Most people are clearly deficient. I'd say 50% of us are deficient, which is below 30 is the cutoff. And most people the other half of the people are in the 30s, so not high at all. So it tells us that those of us living in Ohio need to supplement or get more sun. We got to do something. What is really fascinating to me is with the COVID story, because they've done a lot of studies with COVID, obviously, in the last year and a half. And one of those fields of study and interest is vitamin D. We know that people who are deficient in vitamin D have the same inflammatory marker elevations as COVID patients. So interleukin-6 is an inflammatory marker. It goes up in COVID. It's high in people who have low vitamin D levels. Tumor necrosis factor is another one that's elevated in both conditions. Coagulopathies, or the blood's susceptibility to clot, is higher in both conditions. So that's really important that we're careful with that. So we know that the elderly are more at risk for dying from COVID, mm-hmm. and it may have something to do with the fact that they tend to be lower in vitamin D. We also know that the obese, especially the morbidly obese, that's been my observation, they're at the highest risk. Well, they're storing their vitamin D in their fat, and they can't get it out, so they need to supplement. Number one. Number two, they can't take a deep breath and push their diaphragm down because their bellies get in the way, and to prevent that. And this is a disease where you're struggling to breathe. You've got to be able to get in oxygen or you just tire out. So that's another factor in morbidly obese. But the other point with obesity is it's an inflammatory state. The more obese we come, from overweight to 20 pounds overweight to morbidly obese, the more inflammation we have. So that's an issue. And then, again, I mentioned the darker skinned people who have problems with this. So there's some exceptions, though, in some of these observations, because it seems that the mortality rates of COVID are higher in those latitudes above the 35th parallel. And if you don't know exactly where that is, that line really follows the northern tip of the states in that border Mexico. So Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, those are all below the 35th parallel. But most of the other states in our country are above the 35th parallel. We're not getting enough natural sun, and we tend to see that we have lower vitamin D levels. So we've noticed that these areas where they don't get enough sun, higher mortality rates, more COVID infections. Interesting that in the Nordic countries, in Sweden and Norway and Denmark, they have lower mortality rates of COVID, but these are countries where they supplement freely with vitamin D. So you can't say that this is a cause and effect. You can say there's an association.
Yeah.
Now, in Italy and Spain, they have higher rates of COVID mortality and infection, and they have lower vitamin D supplementation levels than those countries in the Nordic regions. So we're starting to put together a story here, and we're making these observations that vitamin D is critical to help us. So we know that there's an increased risk of COVID when your vitamin D levels are less than 30. When your vitamin D levels are less than 30, you have almost a 1.5 times increased risk of developing COVID. And those people also have almost a twofold increase in hospitalization. So this is this is pretty simple, right? Mm-hmm. Just one thing we can do as a preventive measure, it's not the only thing, is supplement with vitamin D. So we started to do some studies with vitamin D, and one was a study looking at older hospitalized patients who had COVID-19. They looked at 105 subjects all over the age of 65, and they had COVID-like symptoms. And they noticed that those who had vitamin D levels less than 27, again, I'm recommending that people get vitamin D levels up between 50 and 80 or 60 and 80. That requires supplementation, and half of our county is probably below 30. So in this study, there was these people had, on average, their vitamin D level was 27. These people had a 67% increased risk of developing COVID, and they had a higher requirement for ventilation, mechanical ventilation. So there's another observation. We had vitamin D levels are associated with worse progression in hospitalized patients. Looking at, there was a study where they said, let's see if we can prove that it's not only an association, but there's a cause and effect. So what they did is they supplemented a group of 76 people. They put them in a placebo group that got nothing, and then the control or the treatment group got an ample supplementation of vitamin D in the active form. In other words, it was already prepared for where the body was going to use it. And of this group, those who were not supplemented, 50% of these people ended up in the ICU versus 2% of those who had this ample vitamin D supplementation. So this is really important that we supplement with vitamin D, not only for our immune system to help us fight these just upper respiratory and viral infections, but also this is a really powerful protective agent against the COVID-19, which is also a viral infection. So, they say that we say that flu rates are higher in the winter. Well, everybody assumes because we're indoors and we're passing these viruses along. But you see this also in places in California where it's still warmer and people are outside, still not getting the vitamin D they need. If your vitamin D level isn't robust, you're more susceptible to viral infections. So is it not that we're indoors in the wintertime? Is it that our vitamin D level is so low that our immune system is compromised? Because we know vitamin D activates the immune system, that it makes us more vulnerable. Yeah. So again, this is all just, it's a really simple message. We need to supplement. And a lot of times people wait until they're sick to do things. I don't think it's too late, but I would certainly make vitamin D supplementation a daily habit. I've been telling patients for years, you need at least 5,000 units of vitamin D. And a lot of us, for me, for example, I take 10,000 units because I want my level between 60 and 80. Mm-hmm. And some people say, well, you can get too much and you can cause kidney stones. Well, it requires very, very high levels. If you stay below 10,000 or below, you're not going to have to worry about that. Even probably 15,000 units, it's not going to be a problem.
How many are you getting in a one-a-day kind of tablet or something?
That's a great question. And different pharmacies, supplement makers have different amounts. Sometimes it's only 500 units. Sometimes it's 1,000 or 2,000. I was listening to a podcast with an ICU critical care doctor who was taking 2,000 units a day, and he was actually doing a lot of the research on what we're talking about. And he said, I bumped mine up to 5,000 after I read the data. So I think 5,000 is a good starting place for everyone. And then just have your vitamin D level checked. But I don't think there's anybody that couldn't benefit from 5,000 units a day. And that's probably the highest amount you can get in a given supplement. So I take a capsule. Again, I use the Mako's version of Nutriscriptives, 5,000 unit capsule, take 2 a day. And that keeps my level up. Supplements are hard to keep taking over time because, every time you go buy them, you're thinking, do I really need this? Mm-hmm. I don't feel any different. Well, here's sound evidence that you do need vitamin D, and you should never stop taking it. And some people are going to have a higher requirement.
Well, we sure hope that you can go out and do that, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg either.
No, it's really affordable, really simple. Yeah. And then vitamin C and zinc, 50 milligrams of zinc, 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C. Those are also strong recommendations that many, many practitioners who are fighting COVID and having success with treating it, either as an outpatient or as an inpatient, those are the levels they're recommending. But again, it's harder to play catch up. When somebody's hospitalized really sick with this, it's a little bit harder. Yeah. It needs to be more of a preventive mode.
All right. Well, thanks for getting us up on vitamin D. Next time we'll ask you why they call it a vitamin when it really isn't, but that's for
a different
show.
Topic, but I'm happy to tackle it.
All right, we'll do that. That is Dr. Tim McKnight this morning here on Talk with the Doc.